We continue to discuss this topic of Holy Communion and what that means. Now, Holy Communion is indeed the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ, and it puts us in communion with Jesus and helps us to stay there. But that's not all. It's also a sign of our communion with Christ and with his church. This is why at funerals and weddings, I'll make an announcement before communion and say that whereas this is our belief, it also is a sign of our communion with the church, with all her teachings, and with the bishops. So if I don't believe those things, if I'm not in communion, I can't come up and receive Holy Communion. It would be scandalous, we should be scandalized, if we saw a non-baptized person, an atheist, walk up and take Holy Communion, because he's not in communion. He hasn't come into communion through the sacrament of Holy Baptism. It would likewise be scandalous if a notorious and unrepentant sinner came and took Holy Communion, because he hasn't come back into communion. He hasn't reunited himself with Jesus through the sacrament of confession. It would likewise, it should be scandalous if, average Joe Catholic who doesn't think about Jesus for 1 second of his day shows up at Easter Mass and just takes the host. Because as a sign of communion with Jesus and his church, when we come forward for Holy Communion, we actually have to be in Holy Communion with him, so that if someone were watching us, they wouldn't be scandalized. To say that another way, to receive Holy Communion while not living in Holy Communion is actually a lie. It is the source of our union, but it's not the source of our reunion. If a husband and wife, for instance, have a big fight, they don't reconcile by jumping into bed with one another. If they do that, they might experience a physical union, but that would be it, and it would leave them unsatisfied. No, first they have to apologize to each other. They have to forgive one another. They have to have a reconciliation of wills and hearts. Otherwise, any further action is merely an empty lie. And so too with our relationship with God. If we're not living in spiritual union with him, it's impossible for us to have this physical union with him, sacramentally. The physical union of spouses, the nuptial embrace, it's a great benefit to them. It's a renewal of their vows at the altar. There's a grace that's poured out every time they enter into with this complete self-gift. But in a certain sense, it's not essential. We all know couples, whether by age or illness or disability, who aren't able to enter into sexual union, but who still enjoy this deep interpersonal union. But a married couple that does not communicate, even discuss, talk, on the other hand, they're destined for failure. Our goal as Catholics is to always be living in communion with Jesus at every moment of every day. On occasion, we get to receive his body and blood as a sign of that communion and as a further source of that communion. The church actually only requires us to receive Holy Communion in a state of grace once a year during the Easter season. So apparently she thinks that's sufficient. Not too many years ago, not even 100 years ago, that was the norm, that you would receive once a year, a couple times a year, or you'd have to get permission from your spiritual director to receive on a monthly basis. As many saints who have been characterized by surviving on nothing but the Eucharist, like St. Catherine of Siena, or who have died for the Eucharist, like St. Tarcisius, or who have died from receiving the Eucharist, like St. Imelda. There have been many, many more who have been characterized by their absence of the Eucharist. Saint Francis Xavier, actually, when he was on his ship out to the Orient, out to the East, he wasn't able to celebrate Mass on the boat because he needed special permission to do so, which he didn't have. Likewise, Charles de Foucauld, he was out in the desert. He had a server who ended up not wanting to live in the desert and left. And at that time, you weren't allowed to celebrate Mass without a server. And he petitioned Rome and was waiting and waiting and waiting for permission, and it never came. So for months, he doesn't get to even celebrate Mass. Even our own St. Maximilian Kolbe, he was in Auschwitz and maybe got to celebrate Mass once or twice during that time, but certainly not in those 2 weeks before he died. And yet he still met Jesus with a smile on his face, even though he'd been absent of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. St. Therese, you read her, it sounds like she was never able to receive communion as often as she wanted to. Many a saint has gone months without receiving Holy Communion, yet always living in Holy Communion. Many a martyr has gone to her death without the grace of viaticum, yet constantly journeying with Jesus in a relationship of profound grace. How do we live that spiritual communion? I'll talk more about that in the next video.